Tina. Hi, everyone. I'm in a new faculty in the physics department in Princeton. I work on a diverse set of problems in learning, both in natural systems and artificial systems. So most of my work has focused on animal behavior and navigation. I've also been thinking about decision making at the level of single cells and collections of cells. I won't be talking about those today. Today, I'll be talking about something that we've been thinking about lately quite a bit, which is transformers. These are the models that underlie large language models like ChatGPT. And the goal for today, I understand that many of you are not used to thinking about machine learning. This is going to be a mixture of a tutorial and a research talk. So I'm going to present one particular story. And the hope is just to really give a flavor of the kind of questions that are in this space and what role physicists can play here. And I do think it's a fascinating field. There's a lot of conceptual questions that I think are quite fundamental. Um, All right, so I'm going to begin by actually talking about flight. Okay, so if you think about the history of flight, we go back to the 15th century. This is Da Vinci. These are drawings from him, and he was trying to figure out how to make flying machines. And if you look at these drawings, it's pretty clear that he was inspired by birds. So birds kind of told us that flight was possible. And so the first attempts at emulating flight were to build machines that look and behave like birds. Now, if you actually look at what were the first flying machines, they kind of look like birds. They do have, wings and all, but the way they work is actually a little bit different, right? So they have like fixed wing aircraft. There's a picture of the Wright brothers flying their first plane. The interesting aspect of this, which I want to highlight, is that when the Wright brothers came up with their design, there isn't a theory of aerodynamics, right? I mean, the theory came later. This is Prandtl's theory from 1904, a few years later, and eventually in 1910s, we had von Karman with his vortex street. And it took us really about 100 years to really figure out many of the principles of biological flight, right? So this is still an open problem. Insect flight, the physics is quite complicated, and it really took us a long time to go from building the first machines to figuring out how biology does certain things. I think the analogy with intelligence is actually quite similar in the sense that in some ways, what we have had so far, right? So let's say we all care about trying to understand what makes an intelligent being. The real we knew it was possible because we exist, and there was only one way of really figuring out common principles of intelligence, which is to study brains, right? So you can take, this, I don't know which side you want to consider, natural versus artificial, but you can take one path, you can study brains, and that was one way to get to intelligence. But now we have this other path. One can argue whether the mechanisms are the same or not. They're likely different, but it's clear that they're pretty interesting features in these artificial agents that we have right now. And the question is, can we extract some conceptual principles that also tell us something about brains, but also intelligence more generally, right? So that's really the goal. In this talk, I want to focus on one particular phenomenon, which was surprising. It was discovered in 2020 when the first GPTs came out. This is a phenomenon known as in-context learning. And I'll just give you a brief example. So this is me interacting with ChatGPT. So if you ask ChatGPT this question in this conversation, always answer in one word. Alice has father Bob, Bob has sister Carol, Carol has son Dave, then Alice has aunt, you know, um, it has to give the answer. Now, if you think about this task, it's a fairly simple task. I think we've gotten used to the interacting with these models, and we know that this is a really a straightforward task for these models. But if you think carefully about what the model is doing, it's quite remarkable, right? So it's quite likely that it has not seen this specific prompt in its training set. um, but it's able to answer the right question. And in some sense, what it has done is that it's figured out how to learn. So you're feeding it new information, you're giving it information about the relationships between different entities in a sentence, and it's figured out how to put those relationships together and give you the right answer, right? So this is in general called in-context learning. It's a kind of a meta-learning phenomenon in the sense that if you train a model on a diverse enough set of tasks, and if you train a large enough model, you get this behavior. So it's some kind of emergent behavior that you see in these models. This is a formal definition. You can think about in-context learning as a paradigm for learning, um, given only a few examples in the form of a demonstration, right? So this is a prompt that you're giving to the model. And the key part about this is that there are no parameter updates, right? So you're interacting with this large language model. It has a set of parameters that have been tuned during training, but when you're interacting with that model, nothing is changing, right? So all the parameters are fixed. Everything is propagating in terms of activations. And I'm going to explain how the architecture of these models looks like in a second. One interesting aspect of this feature of in-context learning is that it gets better with scale. So if you take models of different scales on the x-axis, these are the number of parameters in these models, um, and you take a fixed data set, you train these models on this data set, and you test them on a specific set of in-context learning tasks. There are 5 tasks here, and as you scale up the model size, the models just get better, right? So that's really they call this scaling, and it turns out to, you know, it's remarkable that as you scale the systems, they just get better and at these kinds of tasks. Okay, so that's for language, but it turns out that these models are, you see similar features in other kinds of tasks as well. So this is a foundation model for time series, which means it's a large transformer model trained on a lot of time series data from different both synthetic and natural time series data. Again, you see a similar phenomenon here. So for example, if you train a model, a foundation model that has never seen the Lorentz attractor, and you give it just some part of the Lorentz attractor and ask it to fill up the rest, it's able to do it zero shot, even if it has never seen the time series before. So you can see that over here. It's fairly decent at reconstructing the attractor. And in fact, this ability to reconstruct the attractor gets better with scale, right? So if you do this with a small model, here the tiny one, there's like 5 classes of model sizes. You train them on the same data set and you ask it to reconstruct the attractor given a small amount of data, and the larger models just do a better job, right? So the key question, I would say, or 2 key questions here are what's happening with scale, right? So clearly, as you feed more data, the models get better. So there's a scaling with data. And as you make the models larger, they also get better, right? So fundamentally, there's a question of what's happening when you scale these 2 axes. There's also more quantitative and the practical questions about how you should scale them together. These are the kind of scaling laws that folks follow when you're training a large language model. Okay. So underlying all of this is this architecture known as a transformer. So personally, I really believe that many of the recent developments that we've seen in machine learning come from the development of this one particular architecture. So it's kind of close to my heart. So I want to give a high-level description of a transformer, and actually later on, I'll give you the actual equations underlying a simple transformer. And it's really quite remarkable. It's a fairly simple architecture, but you just scale it up in a somewhat straightforward way. Okay, so this is a 2017 paper, and we still work with the basic version that was introduced back then. So you can think of a transformer as something that takes a set of objects as input. So it's not like a multi-layer perceptron that you might have seen, which takes a single vector as an input. It takes a set of vectors as an input, and it produces a new vector as an output, right? So that's really that's what a transformer does. It operates on sets of objects. And in particular, it operates on vector representations of objects. So here, these objects, I've kind of marked them with different colors. You embed each object in a vector space. It's some very large vector space. Usually, it's like 10,000 dimensional in one of the large language models. You also often assign some notion of position. So if it's a sentence, you kind of say that this is the first word and second sentence is the second word and so on. And now you have vector representation for each word and its position in the sentence. And you train this model to predict the next word, right? So you give it part of a sentence and then you ask it to predict the next word in the sentence. And you can really think of this as a many-body system. I mean, we're all coming presumably from, we have a physics background. You can really think about this as a system that implements many-body interactions, right? So you pass all these vectors through what's known as an attention head, and I'll specify what an attention head is later on. You pass them through an attention layer. This introduces mixing between the different words or tokens, as they call them. Once you mix them up, each token applies a nonlinear map. Usually it's a multi-layer perceptron, and you iterate this process many times, and ultimately you get a vector representation of the full sentence, and you predict the next word based off that representation. Okay, so it's really a you can think of this as a many-body system. All right. Okay, so it turns out that if you take a transformer and you train them on a diverse set of tasks, you take a fairly simple transformer and you train them on a diverse set of tasks, they start generalizing to data that they've never seen before. So this is not from our work. This is from a paper from Hidenori Tanaka's group in Harvard. This is just an example to illustrate the kind of phenomena that you get. So this is a two-layer transformer trained on Markov chains, data from Markov chains. So this is trained on data from k different Markov chains, which means that you draw k different transition matrices from some ensemble. You simulate sequences from these Markov chains, and you train a transformer to predict the next symbol in the Markov chain given some history drawn from one of those transition matrices. Okay, so there's two things going on here. So the x-axis is training. So what you're seeing is how the transformer behaves as a function of training time. And on the y-axis are the number of training chains in your data. So each row corresponds to a different model and a different data set. And each row corresponds, as you go up in the row index, you're changing the number of training chains that you're feeding into the transformer. And you can draw these kinds of phase plots. It turns out that the behavior of the model changes over time, so going from left to right, but it also changes as you go from bottom to top, which is you make the data more complex, you get increasingly interesting behavior. And you can show that when k is small, you see some kind of a memorizing phase in the sense that as the data is coming in, the transformer recognizes which chain the data is being drawn from, and it produces its output accordingly. And that's this red phase over here. And beyond a certain k value, as you make the data sufficiently diverse, they start generalizing, which means that if you feed them data from a Markov chain that they've never seen before, they're still able to figure out the statistics of the Markov chain in context and produce sequences that are consistent with that Markov chain, which this is really the capability that we are excited about. And clearly it's a scaling phenomenon, right? So as you increase some number, there's a transition that happens. So we we've been interested in characterizing what determines these transitions, right? So we have a phase diagram. Now we have to characterize the phases and explain what characterizes, the boundaries between the different phases. So roughly speaking, there's this threshold K star, where the transition happens between memorization and generalization. We want to say where that comes from. And there's a different transition during learning. So as you're training a transformer, there's a moment where you don't see any generalization, and suddenly you see an aha moment, and it generalizes perfectly to new sequences. So there's this other transition, and we want to characterize that as well. Right? That's the goal. And for the purposes of this talk, we're going to be working with not with this task. We're still working on figuring out the phase diagram over here. We're going to be working with a simpler task that also shows the same features, but we can basically figure out everything in that simpler setting. Okay, so this is going to be a description of the task that I'll be talking about going forward. It's really a highly simplified task and a highly simplified model, but you can, we're doing baby steps here, so we're kind of working with the simplest possible settings and trying to go up in complexity. But you'll see that it captures the core features that I just mentioned. Okay, so what you do is that first you draw k random vectors in d dimensions. So you can think of these as your objects, like images. These are proxies for, let's say, images of different animals. And you give each of these k items labels. And again, these are binary labels. So these are plus or minus one labels. And you freeze your data set, right? So now you generate a data set of k item label pairs, and now you freeze it. Now, okay, so what do you feed to the transformer, right? So you give sequences of the sort, and I'll explain in more detail what the sequence represents. So you give it a sequence of item label pairs. So here there's four item label pairs that we've given in sequence. So there's an orange item and its corresponding label, which is +1, a blue item and its corresponding label -1, and so on. And finally, you ask it to figure out what's the label for a new orange square, x4 over here. And the task of the transformer is to predict, in this case, red, right? So +1, because orange corresponds to +1. Now, you just feed this to the transformer. There's a rule over here. The rule is that there's always going to be a copy of the query, in this case, the orange one in the context. And so the model has to figure out or learn this rule, right? So it has to figure out that there's actually there's a copy of this item in the context. It can use that information, or it can memorize the mapping from items to labels, right? So K is finite. So if you give it enough data, you give it many such sequences, it can choose to completely ignore what's in the context and just predict that, it's a +1 for orange. Yep. Maybe this is a little bit more intuitive. So this is an interesting case where it went the other way. We first did this in the machine learning setup, and someone else actually designed an experiment with humans to test how humans do on this kind of task. This was done by Chris Sommerfeld's group in Oxford earlier this year. So let's say you kind of have k item label pairs. Here there's images paired with different numbers. And there's a particular rule, which is that you have to look at an image, and the rule is that the label is 3 steps away in the circle, right? It's not as trivial of a rule as we are working with, which is like it's right next to it. But there's a rule. But in every kind of example that you give to the participant, you kind of swap your items and labels. So they have to figure out that there is a rule, but they can also memorize it, right? So the bear is always mapped to 1, so they can predict 1 when they see the bear, but they can also learn the rule and figure out that there is this rule. So that's the analogous human task. Okay. Um, I'll just mention, skipping a few details, that this task, you can solve this task, or transformer can solve this task as long as it has 2 layers of attention followed by a multi-layer perceptron, an MLP, followed by a binary classifier. I'll explain what each of these means in the next few slides. So you can consider the next few slides as some kind of an introduction to a transformer, but this will also be central to what I'll be talking about going forward. Okay. Um, okay, yeah. One other thing I should mention potentially is that when we feed this to a transformer, each of these items is fed in as a vector, as I mentioned before. So for example, this item, It's a d-dimensional vector, right? So each object is d-dimensional. So you construct a d plus one dimensional input vector, and the first d you set it to x and set the final d plus one dimension to 0. And for the labels, you keep the first d 0, and then you put a plus one at the d plus one slot, or minus one at the d plus one slot. So that's the data that you give to the transformer. Okay. So it turns out that in this very simple, before I go to the tutorial slides, I think I have them in a different order here. This is the phenomenology that you see with these models. So first, as you tune up K, you train different models for different values of K, which is the number of item label pairs in your data set. You go from essentially chance accuracy to perfect generalization accuracy. So it's able to kind of figure out the answer if even if it has never seen a particular item label pair because it has learned the rule, and it turns out it happens at a very particular value of k at roughly 10 to the 4. So that's something that we want to figure out, what determines that k star. So this is the generalization from memorization to from transition from memorization to generalization. And the other transition that we see, which is what I mentioned earlier as well, is that during training, there's a sudden transition from basically chance accuracy to perfect accuracy, right? So these are two different seeds, so which is why you're seeing two different curves. But we also want to characterize what determines this transition over here. Funnily enough, you also see this in experiments, right? So if you do this with human participants, the x-axis is something slightly different. It's not k, it's some kind of some parameter that controls the distribution of item label pairs that you give in the context, and you see this transition as well, where at some point they go from memorizing to generalizing. So that's a common feature. Okay. Okay, so this is the actual tutorial part about transformers. So I'm going to first describe a one-layer transformer, and I'm going to write down all the equations, which I think at least that helps for me. I hope that helps for you as well. So the way to think about a transformer, as I mentioned before, is that you're getting a sequence or a set of vectors. Here there's 5 vectors, U1 to U5. What an attention operation does is that it pools all the vectors into one of the vectors. So U1, for instance, um, okay, maybe I'll explain U5. So U5, for instance, gets a linear combination of U1 to U5 and adds it onto itself. So it looks like a linear operation, but it's actually a nonlinear operation because you have this attention head that decides how much weight to put into each of these vectors in the context, and that weight is determined by the vectors themselves, right? So the attention map looks like this particular form. It normalizes to 1, so you can think of it as I'm going to pay attention to this, this, and this, but I cannot pay attention to too many things all at once. So I have a constraint that the attention weights have to sum up to 1. Now there's 3 matrices over here. They're called the key, query, and the value matrix, and these are the 3 matrices that determine an attention head. Basically, the key and the query tell a particular word, which other word in the sentence to pay attention to, right? So that's like determining your attention weight. And the value matrix determines what about that word I want to write onto myself. So you can really think of the A matrix as a read operation. You read things in your sentence, and the value matrix as a write operation. You decide what to write onto yourself. Now, apart from the attention operation, there's no other interactions between the tokens, right? So this is really the operation that implements all of the interactions between the different words. Otherwise, they're all independent, right? So this is really the interaction aspect of the system. Now, once you do this, you get a new representation of the sentence in terms of these V's, V1 through V5. Once you apply the attention operation. And in a one-layer transformer, you do something very simple. which is that you take the very last token or word, and I keep using token because that's the machine learning jargon. In machine learning, you kind of break up words into tokens so that it's more efficient. I'm going to use them interchangeably, but you can think of tokens as words or objects, right? So you take the representation of the last token over here, and you pass it through a multi-layer perceptron. And a multi-layer perceptron is basically a perceptron. It's like a classifier, but you stack many layers of them. You've probably seen this before. If you write them out in equation form, it looks like this. So basically, you take a vector v5, you multiply it by a matrix W1, and then you apply a nonlinearity, right? And then you iterate them L times, so that becomes a L layer perceptron. And there's all these matrices that you train as eventually through gradient descent, right? So you have all these matrices that you're optimizing in a one layer transformer. So even if it's one layer, it actually has quite a lot of parameters in principle. Now, the output of a perceptron or an MLP, it's a logit. You can think of a logit really as an energy value. So if you're performing a binary classification task, you're deciding the probability that it is +1 or -1. And of course, essentially the probability is determined by you can call it the energy difference between the two states. And the logit is really the energy difference between the two states, right? So you're trying to predict the energy gap between the two states that you're trying to predict. So that's what we call a logit. And given a logit, we define what's known as a cross entropy loss, which is a log of, you can think of this as a partition function. And once you have your loss, you minimize the loss and you train your parameters that way, right? So that's how you kind of get all the parameters. I want to give a brief description of a two-layer model. And just as a reminder, if you think about ChatGPT, it's actually the same attention layer MLP operation applied many, many times, right? So it's the core operation is really the same, but you can start doing interesting things when you stack layers one on top of each other. And I just want to illustrate that here with a two-layer transformer because that's what we'll be using in our task. So an attention, one layer attention does this, which I showed you before. So with one layer of attention, you can start copying representations of words from one to another. One thing I should mention is that whenever you're doing language modeling, you want to impose a causality bias in the sense that a word can only pay attention to something in the past, which makes sense. And so in this case, this word U3 can only pay attention to U1, U2 or itself, right? So that's a causality mask. So for example, here, U3 could pay attention to U2 and copy information about U2 onto itself. That's what the first attention layer does. Now, what the second attention layer does is exactly the same thing. It's really the same operation, but now it operates on the V's instead of the U's. But once you do this, you can start doing interesting things. You can do multi-hop reasoning, or in this case, two-hop reasoning. So you can copy information about U2 to U3 based off some interaction between them. And in the second layer, you can copy the combined information between U2 and U3 into some other token, right? So in the initial example the first example that I showed with the family trees, with Alice and Bob and Carol, you need to do a multi-hop reasoning task. The machine needs to figure out these relationships. And you can imagine once you stack these layers up, you can start forming increasingly complicated, start learning increasingly complicated relationships between the entities in your sentence. And that's what depth really gives you. You can kind of see this mathematically as well. So if you kind of plug in your V's from the first layer into the equation for the second layer, you start seeing the number of terms starts increasing, but you can start seeing this kind of three body interaction terms over here where you have interactions between U2 and U3 and then potentially V3 to V5. And so you can start implementing more complicated computations. So I mentioned before that for the task that we're interested in, you need at least two layers. So I want to go through the mechanism for that. I'm not going to tell you how we figured out that mechanism. So uh, we didn't figure out ourselves the first time. So we figured out that it works for this task, but it was a this was figured out in a paper by Anthropic. This is the company that provides cloud, the LLM cloud, which you might have interacted with. So they figured out this mechanism. It's called an induction head. Um, and I would say the induction head is somewhat like the simple harmonic oscillator of transformer models, right? It's kind of non-trivial, but it's also fairly intuitive to understand, but it also illustrates how zero-shot learning can happen. And we also see this operation happening in real transformers, in large language models. So it has everything going for it. Um, so induction head implements something that I call zero-shot associative learning, right? So in a sentence, let's say you've never seen X, Y together during pre-training, right? So when you train your model, you've never seen X and Y together. But let's say when you're writing out your sentence, you see X and Y together. And now you see X again later in the sentence, right? So let's say you've never trained on Harry Potter books, but you see Harry Potter in the sentence, and now you see Harry again, right? What should the model do, right? The best guess is that it should guess Potter, right? So that's basically zero-shot learning because it's never actually seen Harry Potter, but it's figured out that Harry and Potter come next to each other. The mechanism for this is the induction head, and it's been figured out, and it's kind of canonical at this point. Um, and I'm going to kind of um, um, explain it in conceptual terms. The mechanics in a real model is slightly different, but it's useful to think about these kinds of cartoons. So this is a case where you have just five tokens, right? So you have blue, pink, orange, green, and blue again. And the model is supposed to predict pink, right? So it's similar to the task that we have. Um, so the way to think about an induction head is that you imagine each token as having three different axes: a position, which tells you the position of the token in the sentence, content, which is in this case just blue, and a buffer. A buffer is like places where you can store memory. It's a subspace, right? These are all vectors, and you can think of these as different subspaces in your representation. And the model has learned to kind of orthogonalize these different spaces and write and read information from these different spaces. So what the first layer of an induction head does is that each token pays attention to the position, uses a position to pay attention to the previous token. Okay, so you kind of you have a read operation where you look at the token right behind you, and you copy the content of that token into the buffer of yourself. So, right, so you kind of copy the blue content onto the buffer of the pink one. Now, the buffer of the pink one has the information about blue, right? So it's kind of copied that information. And now the second layer uses the content to pay attention to the buffer of everything in the context. Now, since it's paying attention, so the attention is a dot product operation. So it basically takes the dot product of these blue vector with whatever is in the green vector, and these two are going to match, right? Because now this one has information about the blue object, and it's going to copy the content of what it paid attention to onto its buffer in the second layer, right? So now this token over here has information about the label pink, and it's going to now that it has information, it's going to produce that logic and it solve the task. So that's how it works. This is known as an induction head. This is a minimal kind of cartoon picture of an induction head. Okay, so this is what's happening in a two-layer attention model, and this is what is described in this paper. But going forward, I'm going to simplify this a little bit and kind of simplify the first step of this operation and concatenate the two vectors together, right? So we're going to do the first operation by hand and then work with the one layer transformer. One layer transformer we can do theory with. It's just a simplification. And we're going to see all the phenomenology even with the simpler settings. So we're going to work with this. I want to pause here for a couple of minutes and take any questions because now I'm going to go into the analysis of this model for the final 10 minutes or so. So if there's any clarifying questions about either transformers or the task, I think this is a good time.
Boris, please go ahead and ask.
Yeah, it's probably a very naive question, but I have a couple of questions about combinations of attention layers. First, you say that if you have two layers, you can have some relationship you cannot get with one layer. What happens if you add third layers? So is there some gain from adding layer after layer, or is it diminishing returns and two layers is what you need?
Yeah, there's a lot of theory trying to figure out what you can do with a transformer of a particular depth. It turns out that you can do a lot even with one layer. And in a regular transformer, you don't just have one attention head per layer, you have multiple attention heads potentially. So you can do a lot of computations with a single layer as well. Uh, my personal belief, and it's a belief because we haven't shown it yet, is that multi-layer transformers allow you to do a higher order reasoning or analogies. So for example, a two-layer is something that you need to do copying. So you can't do copying the operation that I mentioned with one layer. You absolutely need two layers to do it. Now, if you want to kind of draw larger structural analogies across the sentence, I suspect that you need more layers to do it, but it's not clear yet. I don't think we can show anything like that right now.
And another very simple clarifying question that when I look at your attention formula, you need nonlinearity, otherwise your combination of attention layer would be same. And do you understand correctly that your nonlinearity is in your normalization?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's what I figured out. Thank you.
Are there any other clarifying questions at this point? Okay, I don't see any raised hands. Gautam, maybe you can go ahead and we can then take more questions at the
Okay. I'm going to assume I have 10 more minutes and then I'll take more questions in the end.
Sure, sure.
And I'm going to go a little bit faster going forward. And I think my goal is not to kind of explain all the details, but also to give a flavor of the kind of theory that you can write with these models. So we are working, as you recall, like with a one-layer transformer trained on this task, and we are trying to figure out where these transitions happen, the two transitions that I mentioned. So these models, even the two-layer or the one-layer ones, are complicated enough that you have to work with ansatz. You can't write down an exact theory. And so we came up with two different ansatz, so to speak, which allow us to do theory, and then we come up with predictions that we can test using numerical experiments, right? That's kind of how physics is done. You do an approximation that makes sense, and then you test it later. And the first ansatz is to assume that uh, the subcircuits are independent. What I mean by that is that if you think about a transformer, you have paths that information goes through different paths. So as information comes in, it goes through an attention layer, and then you add it on top, and then you pass it through an MLP. In this case, there's just two subcircuits. One is the attention layer, and one is the MLP. We're going to assume that these two operate independently, right? So you can think of these as different parts of the circuit that do their own thing. What that means in mathematically is that the logit that you get, this energy difference in the two states, is the sum of the logits produced by one part of the circuit and the other part of the circuit. This is mathematically not true if you write down the equations, but we're going to say that this is true and work with that assumption and come up with predictions. The second ansatz that we're going to do is to simplify the attention layer. This task has various symmetries because all the x's are drawn from a spherical Gaussian, and so it's symmetric in those d dimensions. And you only have two labels. So if you exploit those symmetries, it turns out that you can simplify these three matrices that I showed you for an attention head into really just two parameters, right? You can define an effective interaction strength, so you can make this almost a diagonal matrix with one beta parameter, and you have this value matrix, which is everything is zero except for one parameter w. So we can reduce this whole operation into simply two effective parameters, right? So this is the second ansatz. And now we're going to work with this reduced description of a one layer transformer. And this is what an attention head now looks like once you make this ansatz. You can kind of see how copying can work, right? So if beta is large, your orange, which is your xn plus 1, is going to have a large dot product with this orange, right? Because they match. Now, if beta is large, this orange is going to pay attention to this one, and is going to copy the label information, which is red, onto itself, and the strength of that copy operation is given by W. So so beta and W are the kind of quote unquote the two parameters that matter, and they change during training because they're learned during training, and generalization occurs when both these parameters are large. So now we can characterize the learning dynamics of beta and W. I won't go through the math, but you can go into some limit where you can write down the loss landscape, as they call it. This is the loss. And there's two terms over here that you can focus on. One of them is the logit coming from the multilayer perceptron, which I'm going to call Z plus MLP. And then there's the logit coming from the attention head, which you can write down because of the answers that I mentioned previously. And these two sum up because of the independent answers. There's some fluctuations which come from how you're sampling your sequence. They turn out to be quite important. You need to average over those fluctuations appropriately, but once you do it, this is the loss landscape that you get. Now, typically you start with beta and W small, then you initialize the model. So you can ask, first you can just visualize this loss landscape. This is how it looks like. So you start with W and beta close to the origin, and you can see that eventually this is going to flow down to W and beta large, which is when generalization happens. So we can characterize the learning dynamics because we have this loss landscape over here. The kind of you can ignore the equations. It's just that once you have your initial point, you can expand in a Taylor series, write down the equations you get from equations of motion that you get from doing gradient descent on this loss. And you get something that looks like this. And the key part over here are these coefficients C1. C1 is a proxy for how much memorization has happened by the MLP. And you can compute it as an expectation value. This also changes as a function of time. But essentially what's happening here is that if C1 is constant, there's no memorization, W and beta eventually fall down as well, and you get generalization. But once the MLP memorizes, C1 goes down. The probability that the MLP gets the label wrong goes down and basically slows down learning. So there's a kinetic competition between the two operations, memorization and generalization. As you memorize, generalization is slowing down. So it's really just going to rescale the learning rate. Okay. Okay. So long story short, we came in with into this problem with two hypotheses, right? So you want to characterize what this transition, as you kind of tune the amount of data in your data set, you see generalization versus memorization, and there's two possibilities. So one possibility is that your model is capacity constrained in the sense that if you give it too much data, it doesn't have the capacity to memorize all the data, so it's going to generalize, right? So that's what you call a capacity constraint driven generalization. The second mechanism is that it's a kinetic competition in the sense that there's two independent circuits. They act independently. The network is perfectly capable of memorizing the data set, even for large data sets. But it just so turns out that it memorizes slower if you have a larger data set because you have more samples to memorize. And once you generalize, you stop memorizing because you've explained all the data that you have. Right. So once you generalize, you're basically done. You can get zero loss, and so memorization kind of freezes. So there's these two hypotheses, and long story short, we figured out that it's the latter one that matters, not the former one, which is something that I think naively we came into. It's really a kinetic effect. And again, long story short, if it is truly a kinetic effect, you have two time scales that we have to match in order to predict the transition, which is saying that you have a time scale at which generalization happens, and you can calculate it, which it scales linearly with the length of your sequence and exponentially with where you start your model, initialize your model, and you have a time to memorize, which you can also calculate in principle, but we don't calculate it, we measure it. And the prediction from this hypothesis is that the transition happens when these two time scales match, right? So that's really the idea. And now we do a bunch of numerical experiments with a full one-layer transformer. It's not the toy model anymore. And you can show that in these full models, these predictions are true, which is that generalization scales linearly with the sequence length. And the distribution is also log normal. You see these very long tails that comes from this exponential dependence on the initial conditions. The exponential dependence on the initial conditions comes up because the landscape is quite flat, close to initialization. So and it turns out to be it scales exponentially, right? So the gradient is scales exponentially with where you start from. Okay. The other interesting phenomena here, which perhaps I should skip, is that you have a transition point. If you're above the transition point, you memorize, and if you're below the transition point, you generalize. I think it's actually the other way around. Below the transition point, you memorize, and above you generalize. But based off your initialization, you can fall above or below, right? So you can either be above or below depending on how you initialize your system. And so close to the transition, you should see bimodal solutions. Right, so this is an illustration of what I was mentioning. Depending on how you initialize, you can fall below or above the transition, and this predicts that close to the transition, the solutions are bimodal, and that's precisely what you see in your numerical experiments. You either generalize or memorize, but you don't see both, and you get 50-50 of each. I think the most striking prediction that we could confirm is the scaling relationship between K star, which is when the transition from memorization to generalization happens, and the context length. You can show that there's a very particular scaling relationship between K star and the context length. This is K star scales as n to the 1.4. Don't ask me where the 1.4 comes from. This is an empirical measurement. We don't have a theory for it yet. I think it's an interesting problem. But we can measure this, we can test this prediction in numerical experiments, and that's precisely what we see, right? So we can do these numerical experiments where we train transformer models on different k and n, which is the context length, and you can show that that's precisely when the transition happens. Okay, that's so I think I'm out of time, but that's really my conclusion slide. And it's just really I think, snapshot of the kind of questions that are there in the space, and one particular, I think, a very specific problem that we've decided to focus on. This is essentially a summary of what I just said. The second part of the work was led by Alex, who is a graduate student in the Neuroscience Institute here, and I'd like to thank the department and funding sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam, for a wonderful talk. I guess the floor is now open for questions. So if you have a question, you can probably raise your hand, and I can call on you to ask your question, or you can type it and I can read it for you. Okay, I already see a question from Marco Poland. Marco, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it, or would you like me to ask it?
Yeah, I can ask it. So thanks for the talk. It was very nice. I'm not from. I don't really do these things, so pardon me if my understanding of what you said was incomplete, and so maybe the question is a bit stupid. But I was thinking when the system generalizes, is there in any meaningful sense, any sort of left memorization in the system? I'm thinking that perhaps, in a sense, some of the answers could be, in a sense, memorized, and others could be the result of generalization.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's an experiment you can do where you control the rank frequency distribution of the examples that you present. So you can have some examples that are presented a lot more often than others, and you can decide on the distribution of that. So if you train a transformer on that kind of data, it tends to memorize the most frequent data points, and it tends to generalize using the rest. And you kind of force the system into this mixed state where you're partially memorized, but you also generalize, and that's possible. Um, the other comment I will make is that memorization is always optimal, right? So if you have a finite training set, the best thing you can do is memorize. If you train these networks for very long periods of time, so I just showed for like maybe I think 100,000 iterations, but if you go all the way to million or 10 million, eventually you see this phenomenon where you go back to memorization. That's because there's slight, very slow memorization that continues to happen. At some point, the model actually memorizes everything. And because of a regularization in the way you train these models, it forgets the generalizing solution. So in fact, if you train them for very long, you kind of lose generalization. So that's also, I think, a relevant
Oh,
comment.
very interesting. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, while folks are thinking about questions, I guess I have my own naive question, which I wanted to ask. So I was wondering, the emergence of generalization, can one think of it like, a situation where, sparse but stable generalized representations can grow and then overtake sort of the more metastable kind of, memorized configurations? Like, can we think of it in like a, nucleation kind of a process that we have, often in, thermodynamics, etc.?
Yeah, I think a lot of these learning processes can be thought of that way. And I think part of the goal here is to kind of come up with effective descriptions of learning in that language. I think we still have to figure out, what the axes are. I think that's kind of the attempt so the attempt we made over here. Sorry, I think screen sharing has stopped. I'm going to share again. So these beta and uh, delta parameters, sorry, beta and W parameters that we introduced over here, they're really an attempt at defining what those relevant axes are in these effective landscapes.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I guess that was going to be my next question. Like, can you think of this? Can you think of an effective theory like a Landau-like or similar theory? What would be kind of the response functions or susceptibilities in that theory? Is there
Yeah.
something akin to a symmetry breaking where you see your order parameter emerging and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that's really the goal. It depends on the task that you're trying to solve, like which order parameters kind of matter. But I think if you design the task to have a particular structure with particular symmetries, you can. We haven't. We're trying to do this for more complicated tasks as well. I think we still need to do a lot of work in characterizing the relationship between the tasks, the architecture, and which order parameters, quote unquote, order parameters matter. That's a whole research program.
Mhm. Thank you. I think there are other questions. I'm going to read Ria and Abhishek. Ria, do you want to ask your question directly? Would you like me to read it out? Oh, she would like me. Okay, so lovely talk from Ria Samantha. I'm quite new to this, so I might get some terms wrong. In one of the first slides for in context learning, it seems some tasks fare better than others as one increases the number of parameters. Do we know why?
So I suppose it's related to this one, right? Um, I'm not sure. So I think one of the well, okay, so the question was about why certain tasks are, growing faster than others. So reversed words, for instance, seems to be roughly flat, whereas, like the red one, random insertion, just goes up. Um, I, yeah, honestly, I don't know. But also, I think there's something to keep in mind, which is that here the y-axis is accuracy, which is a nonlinear operation, right? So you get like one if you get the answer right and zero if not. So it's a binary thing. And often when you measure accuracy, if you actually measure progress in learning, it turns out to be gradual. But when you plot it in accuracy plot, you start seeing large differences just because, you're applying a nonlinearity there. So the differences might actually be not as large as they seem, is all I'm trying to say. But I think the real answer is that I don't know.
Thank you, Gautam. Okay, there is a question from Ria says, thanks. There is a question from Abhishek Singh, and he says, this is a clarification question. What mechanism was being explained by the induction head?
The mechanism, so induction had explained how zero-shot copying worked, right? So if you see A and B together and you see A again later in a sentence, how do you know, how does the transformer kind of produce B? And it turns out that this is a more general operation, right? So you can think of this at a more, higher order level as well. Like if you see sentences of two kind of structures right next to each other, you can apply this at a higher order level, at the level of sentences or concepts as well. So there's like concept induction heads. But I think it kind of illustrates the general principle that if you have some kind of neighborhood relationship between two different things, you can exploit that to learn zero shot. And so, yeah, that's there's I should mention that initially when in 2022 when Anthropic first came out with the induction head paper, the their proposal was that induction heads are the reason or the core mechanism that underlie in context learning, right? So that's how they pitched it. But in subsequent years, it became clear that, of course, the story is, as usual, a lot more complicated. But also, there's other mechanisms for in-context learning that seem to be quite important as well. And I haven't touched on that at all. But we are working in that as well. It's called a function vector or task vector that the model learns and exploits to do in-context learning.
Thank you. If we have more questions follow up to this, Abhishek, maybe you can stay for the next part, like the informal discussion. I'll take one more question from the audience. This is from Pencil Wen. She says, thank you. In perturbation and cell line studies, I have started seeing foundation models that use transformers to cell line responses to perturbations. Do you have some comments on how well transformer-based models and foundation models capture causal mechanisms? In general, how would memorization and generalization play roles if we predict chemical or genetic perturbation in cell lines?
Yeah, I think that's a great question that, again, I don't know the answer to that question. I think even in LLMs, where most work has been done in the space, it's very hard to disentangle memorization from generalization. Um, because let's say, the famous example, ChatGPT can verbatim reproduce a New York Times article. Um, and one can say it's memorization, but there's a lot of structure in the New York Times article as well, which is more of a generalization kind of feature. So these models seem to be very good at blending the two. They kind of memorize chunks and they also learn how to piece things together. And I suspect that's what's going to happen even in foundation models for other data sets, even when you have a lot of data. And I think this is something that's been observed with AlphaFold as well. It tends to kind of um, do a combination of the two, which makes sense. I think that's kind of, I think memorization is a core part of how we learn as well. So yes, so I'd say that it's just very hard to disentangle the two.